Guess who's the greatest drug producer who has ever lived? Well, Pablo was perhaps the most popular, but the title goes to Haji Juma Khan. He was, as of 2017, producing 53% of opium in Afghanistan, the world's single greatest source of illicit drugs, producing more than Colombia, Mexico, and Myanmar combined. Born in 1955 in Afghanistan's Nimroz Province, he could have been anyone's uncle really, always in shalwar kameez, enjoying his kebabs and always holding his tasbih. But here is a mystery. Arrested multiple times by the US, he was always released with no charges. While America has spent more than $1.7 billion in fighting the heroin trade, Khan runs free. The story resembles the plot of a Netflix series involving a DEA agent, the Taliban, the British Special Forces and the CIA, and explains partly the collapse of the Afghan government in 2021. Here is for you the story of Haji Juma Khan.
धुंधली सी जैसे परछाई
सफेदी में खुशी पाई
बिन रंगों की ये बारूदें
तुम्हें कहीं और ले चले
पहुंचो ऐसी दुनिया में
जो लगे तुम्हारी हो
नींद को विदा करो और रातों में दिन भरो
Hey, do you want to see a film and TV streaming service amplifying Muslim stories and filmmakers? If so, you want to check out our sponsor, USHUB TV. Check the link in the description to find out more. After the collapse of the Taliban government in 2001, US forces realized that Afghanistan was a narcos state that generates up to 10,000 metric tons of opium each year. That's $100 billion. The government was bathing in corruption. Policemen, parliamentarians, governors, and several ministers were on the drug network's payroll. While in other countries drugs are a criminal activity driven by greed, in Afghanistan they are a tool of political power. The story of heroin in Afghanistan starts in 1979. For 150 years, Afghan farmers had grown small amounts of poppy. With the start of the 10-year war between the Soviets and the CIA-funded fighters known as the Mujahideen, the country was destabilized and business got serious. Shinwari tribesmen in eastern Nangarhar made a deal with the Afridis in Pakistan's Khyber Agency and started to process opium into heroin. Profits multiplied, and by the mid-80s, Afghanistan was supplying 1/3 of the world's heroin. Haji Juma Khan started his empire in Bahramcha, a small town in the Chagai Hills on the Pakistani border. He was illiterate, but hey, he was a Hafiz Quran. He first seized control of the area in the dying days of the Taliban rule in late 2001 and turned it into a proper trade route to Pakistan and Iran. In his lab, he imported chemists from across the globe. Heroin for export was hidden as dust in Afghan rugs and even sewed into threads, sent on convoys of high-speed jeeps dashing across the desert towards Iran before ending up in the hands of his main customers, addicts in Europe and Russia. By 2004, Khan had gained control over routes from southern Afghanistan to Pakistan's Makran coast, where heroin was loaded onto freighters to Iran and Turkey. Khan was often traveling to Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Sharjah, where he bought a few properties and a small fleet of cargo ships. And with all his money, he went 7 times to Hajj. People had a lot of respect for the way he treats his competitors, enemies, and friends. His secret was that he didn't have to commit violence to maintain control. He was generous. Nobody around him would pay for their food. He was a total enterprise. from poppy farms to labs and wholesale dealers. To keep his routes open, he bribed everyone: enemy factions, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, the Pakistani intelligence service, and the Afghan government. He had everyone in his pocket. And the more the West was pouring money into fighting drugs in Afghanistan, the more heroin was pouring out of the country. Since 2002, the UK and the US have invested billions on training soldiers, judges, building drug courts, and you know what? The US even tried to use planes to spray Roundup on the fields. It would have been 10 times cheaper to just buy the farmers' opium. At the same time, the poppy crop completely exploded, hitting a record high of 193,000 hectares, enough to carpet Greater London and the Isle of Wight combined. By the late 90s, a handful of traffickers dominated the drug economy: Haji Cherzai, Haji Bashir Nurzai, and Haji Juma Khan. Each of those three men would be targeted by the DEA. Cherzai and Nurzai were tried and convicted in federal courts and sentenced to life in prison, leaving room to Juma Khan to build his empire. Khan was the exception. Briefly detained by the Americans after 2001, he was always quickly released with no trial. The Americans were obsessed with Al-Qaeda all the time. More interestingly, American commanders also believed that the drug trade was a key asset for their counter-terrorism mission. Most information we know about Juma Khan comes 2006, when the DEA agent Edward Follis spent 2 years hanging out with Haji Juma Khan. Follis was briefed to gain Khan's trust, tap him for info, and then take him out of action. Follis introduced himself as a DEA agent, which Khan saw as a value-added figure in his empire. The deal was simple. In exchange of safety, Juma Khan would supply information about his rivals, all targets of the US. At the height of his power, Khan was secretly flown to Washington for a series of clandestine meetings with the CIA and the DEA. Even then, the US was receiving reports that he was on his way to becoming Afghanistan's most important narcotics trafficker. He was so protected that during his visits to the US, Khan would take sightseeing trips to New York and do some shopping, and along the way, he was also paid a $2 million share, cash, by the United States. In 2008, Follis arranged to meet with Khan in Jakarta. He went willingly, believing that the Americans wanted to continue the discussions they had with him in Washington. He even paid for his own ticket. But this time, instead of enjoying fancy hotels and friendly talks, Khan was arrested and flown to New York, and this time, he was not allowed to go shopping. Officially, he was labeled as a Taliban supporter. However, if you ask American officials, they will tell you it was never the case. And surprise, in April 2018, Khan was quietly released without any charges or trial. The details surrounding his release were not even announced in the mainstream media, not even if he was deported or allowed to remain in the United States. All this ambiguity suggests that Khan's relationship with the government did not end with his arrest. The charges carried a minimum sentence of 20 years, but his release after 10 signals that he likely cut another deal. Unlike Pablo Escobar, who eventually succumbed to greed, paranoia, and internal divisions, if Haji Juma Khan is still alive today, it is because of his strength to turn in his enemies and competitors into partners. He put everyone in his pocket, including the US. The case of Haji Juma Khan, just like the war in Afghanistan itself, have dragged on for years, and 20 years on, more than thousands of American soldiers and innocent civilians killed, and more than $1 trillion later, it is unclear what end, if any, has been served. According to several officials, Khan made the government a final offer. In return for an amnesty, he will quit the drugs business and invest his money in Afghanistan. But the drug trade in Afghanistan also hides another problem. Driven by misery and an abundance of cheap heroin, Afghanistan's own addict population is rising fast. According to the last survey in 2018, Afghanistan counts almost 1 million drug users, and the number is almost certainly higher now. When you subscribe to our channel, it helps us demonstrate we've got an audience, so we can apply for resources to create more and better quality content. Thanks for helping us.